We're not going to talk about America's first female preservationist, Anne Pamela Cunningham. Her work was huge and is tied to the work that we're going to talk about today, because the example that she set in starting the Mount Vernon Ladies Association in the mid-1800s is pivotal to many works of preservation that women have undertaken since that time. The Mount Vernon Ladies Association still own and manage George Washington's home, Mount Vernon. Oh, now I'm not advancing. Okay. The town was devastated. The economy was destroyed. Homes and shops were looted. Casualties were everywhere in Fredericksburg in 1865. Those who could have left the town during that awful battle in December of '62 left. But eventually they came back home. Men returned to their businesses to try and bolster some form of sustainability for themselves, their families, and the local economy. Women tended to their homes and families. We know a lot about the battle and its aftermath thanks to diaries from Jane Howison Beale, Betty Herndon Maury, Lizzie Alsop, who are all pictured here, and also the diary of Lizzie Reynolds. They all left their account of living in Fredericksburg during and after the war. When they came, in many instances, they'd gone to family farms that were just outside of town. When they came back to town, what they found was their furniture on the street, their books strewn everywhere, family Bibles. In Lizzie Reynolds' example, she writes a note about the family Bible was in a box marked Massachusetts. Somebody was taking her family's Bible and sending it north. Clothing, there are references to soldiers dressing up in fancy women's clothing that, of course, the evacuees did not take with them when they were running out of town. But all of this was a result of war and what soldiers will do when pressed. Okay.
The federal government provided no assistance to rebury the Confederate dead. The women stepped up to raise the necessary funds. This 1939 recollection discusses the manner in which they raised money. Entertainments, musicals, etc., assisted by local talent, several sets of tableaux at the courthouse. The money they raised went to purchase and make ready the land for the cemetery, have the dead recovered and reburied, and build the monument, the wall, and the gate. Later, Major James Horace Lacey was recruited to raise money for the stone markers. The ladies used what they had, which were talents and conviction. First, they printed 1,000 leaflets and began to reach out across the South for donations. This successful campaign set the stage for further preservation and civic efforts. Much of the work we will be talking about occurred during the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era. Educational opportunities for women were expanding, but these women whose husbands or fathers were merchants, doctors, lawyers, bankers, were expected to attend to their homes and their children. Within that sphere was also church and charity work. These endeavors enabled them to use their education and organizational skills in a broader arena. But in order to do such work away from home, they relied on help in their home. In the 1880 census, there were close to 5,000 people and 1,000 families listed living in Fredericksburg. In that, there were 65 washerwomen, 132 live-in servants, 158 domestic workers, 16 seamstresses, 105 cooks. 73 of those were specifically listed as cooks in family. The nurses were caring for young children, not medical nurses. The majority of all of these workers were women of color, and many of the women we will be talking about today both employed and or housed them in their domestic work.
We'll just keep this little tag team going. No other president's mother is as honored as Mary Washington. President Andrew Jackson came to Fredericksburg May 7th of 1833 to lay the cornerstone for the first Mary Washington monument. It had been organized and built by men. The monument was going to be very elaborate. The picture on the left shows you part of the monument. It was never completed. They built this beautiful base with marble, and they had a columnar shaft that was lying on the ground. They couldn't quite get their funds together to put it up. There was Silas Burroughs had funded this, and his own fortunes failed, and so everything else failed that he was attached to, unfortunately. But this grave site at the Meditation Rock on the sort of northwestern edge of the town and well outside of town in the early 19th century, it was a vacant spot. It was a great place during the Civil War for soldiers to camp and to have target practice. And you'll notice this etching shows the pocked marks from shots that people had taken at this. Family members were enraged. Local residents were unhappy. And despite the pleas to the Congress, the Congress had several bills brought forth that failed to rebuild the Mary Washington Monument. Nothing happened until the property was going to be sold. And two associations developed really within days of each other. One, a local Mary Washington Monument Association, and the other, a national one. They worked in parallel fashion to raise money for a new monument. The local association was chartered on October the 31st, 1889, and it was composed primarily of descendants or members of that Ladies Memorial Association that Florence mentioned. These women knew how to raise money, and so they started a letter writing appeal to people that they knew, to newspapers across the country, using the Mount Vernon model. They had memberships, they held bazaars, they had teas and dances and tableaux. We'll talk about tableau a little later. William Seymour White assisted the local group in his capacity as an attorney and helped ensconce his sister, Mrs. Goulrick, with her family as the first caretaker and resident of the lodge. There was a huge crowd for the public dedication of the completed monument on May the 10th in 1894. President Grover Cleveland came to the dedication. Reports of the day indicate that it was full of pomp and circumstance. The whole town was abuzz. In 1954, for the 60th anniversary of the monument's dedication, they had similar fanfare and a wreath laying, and the then President Dwight Eisenhower came to Fredericksburg to lay the wreath. Well, Ann's already told you what's happening in May this year. It's the 130th commemoration of the dedication of the Mary Washington Monument. Fredericksburg citizens are still proud that that monument to our nation's first mother is in our city. We're not counting on a presidential visit yet.
Following the success of the Mary Washington Monument Association, in 1897, now Mayor William Seymour White suggested that the women could next work to establish a local hospital, the idea having been gathering momentum for some time. He gathered a group together, and within days they had determined that it should be an independent charity organization named Mary Washington Hospital and managed by women. The second meeting was publicized and quickly outgrew the mayor's office and moved to the council chambers. Fundraising began soon after. Again, we see the use of tableau, creating static scenes with costuming and scenery, but no one had to memorize lines as in a dramatic production. This image is not local, but it is an example of a tableau. The ladies held their event at the Opera House, featuring children of the members to raise money for the hospital. The ladies were determined that it would be built and established without taking on any debt. Fundraising continued unabated until the hospital was built and beyond. The cornerstone of the first hospital building on Sophia Street was taken from the remains of that unfinished Mary Washington monument. Oh, that's me. I'm sorry. Within the first month, there had been an auxiliary established to assist with fundraising, but it quickly merged into the originating organization, and it was decided then to add a few more names to the lady managers so that there would be 24, 2 for each month of the year. There were at least 2 women from each of the 7 white churches and the 1 synagogue. In addition, as with most of these organizations, there was a group of men acting as an advisory board. In 1938, an auxiliary was reformed with the purpose of raising funds for the hospital, and all of the leadership were women. Whoops. Oh, what happened there? Sorry.
I'm not going to trust her with the arrows anymore.
Can't touch things. The hospital bylaws were amended in 1940 to include 9 women and 6 men on that board. Here are some of the Mary Washington Hospital's founding women. Mrs. Rowe, at the far side there, was the first lady manager, working with Miss Virginia Aldridge, who was the first matron. The suffrage movement was evident in early 20th century Fredericksburg as it was across the country. 2 days after Mary Johnston, who was head of the Virginia Equal Suffrage League, after she spoke at the courthouse, the local group formed. It was primarily women, but as you can see, it did include some men. Jeanette Fitzhugh, who went by Netta, was the local president. She had marched in the 1913 Women's Suffrage March in Washington, which was a huge event and really was the first march on Washington for a cause. Netta Fitzhugh had invited Mary Johnston a year previous to this to speak to the Fredericksburg Literary Club, an organization of women that still exists in Fredericksburg. Obtaining the right to vote did not happen overnight, but the passage of the 19th Amendment made a huge difference to women's lives, giving them standing, agency, and advantages in business and society that had previously been afforded only to men. This amendment also propelled other struggles for equality throughout the 20th century, and this bloc of voters remain an influential bloc today. The estate of Betty Washington and Fielding Lewis was whittled down from its original 1,300-acre size and had had many owners after the Lewis family. In 1922, Kenmore was for sale. Peck Heflin, noted builder and a local guy, had bought the property and he was going to subdivide it. You can just imagine, close your eyes for a minute, think where you're driving in maybe William Street. You see a big house and all of a sudden there are houses all around it. So members of the newly formed Daughters of the American Revolution rallied. They saw a problem and they were ready to work on it.
And here's the dynamic duo of Emily White Fleming and her daughter, Annie Fleming Smith, known as Miss Annie. Their appeal was similar to others we've mentioned: letter writing, newspaper articles, and they worked closely with the legacy organizations, the DAR and the Colonial Dames. They both possessed a dogged determination to achieve their goals. Not only did they raise the necessary funds to purchase the property from Mr. Heflin, they got him to pony up $2,000 as well. They formed the Kenmore Association. Memberships were granted for a modest annual contribution, and you could pay more. I think it was $25 then for a lifetime membership, which could be handed down in your family. Their cooperative spirit, combined with the necessity of preserving their civic pride, instilled a sentimental fondness which still exists for Kenmore. The Kenmore Association had a huge celebration in 1925 to dedicate the fact that the Kenmore Association now owned this precious property. Governor Trinkle came, events were held across the town, and once again there were opportunities for dress-ups. There were scenes that were reenacted in a tableau, and even young children dressed in colonial costume. Laura Wheelwright from Richmond, who's listed in this list at the bottom as the chairman of grounds of the Kenmore Association, she was an active member of the James River Garden Club in Richmond that had been established in 1915. She was the one who convened 8 other garden clubs in 1920 to form the Garden Club of Virginia. In 1929, she alerted this fledgling Garden Club of Virginia organization about a need to restore the grounds at Kenmore. And with her friend, Frances Archer Christian, came up with the idea for a statewide house and garden tour to raise money. Historic Garden Week in Virginia was launched, and Kenmore was the first beneficiary of these funds. The brick wall at Kenmore and that at the Mary Washington Monument were designated by different landscape architects working for the Garden Club of Virginia. They provide a visual anchor of these 2 important sites on Mary Washington Avenue. As an aside, Jane Goulrick Murrell was the Garden Club of Virginia president in 1978 to 1980. Her aunt was the first caretaker at the Mary Washington Monument, Mrs. Goulrick. See all these connections. And I have to say, the local garden club, the Rappahannock Valley Garden Club, is a member of the Garden Club of Virginia. We, because I am a member of that club, we are celebrating our centennial this year and are happy to say that we have been annual sponsors of a historic Garden Week tour, often with costumed hostesses, although I think that tradition has now gone aside.
The Fredericksburg Cemetery was established in 1844 as a for-profit enterprise by a group of businessmen in town. But it quickly ran into problems, particularly after the Civil War, after which no dividends were ever paid. It was a difficult business model, as families had been responsible for maintaining their own lots, which could have involved enslaved labor, or they could pay a tax to the company. Throughout the late 19th century, there were periods of disrepair and inaction. Troubles were exacerbated by the loss of the records in the 1919 fire at Adams Bookstore, just down Caroline Street. Soon after, Mary Quinn Hicks recruited her friends to help her survey the cemetery and to contact families to see who had been buried in their lots. They pulled this information together, recreated it, found which families were no longer in town or in existence at all, and enabled the board to resell lots and to firm up their finances. In 1925, a women's auxiliary was established and helped secure the fiscal health of the cemetery. In 1934, Mary Quinn Hicks was the first woman elected to the board of that company. And in 1935, the company merged with the auxiliary and reestablished itself as a nonprofit corporation. All of the new officers were women. Many, but not all of these women were members of the Ladies Memorial Association, caring for the neighboring Confederate cemetery, and you've seen most of these names already today.
Historic Fredericksburg Foundation, which was established in 1955, was not a women's organization, nor was it started by women. However, they did rely on the junior board for education, for advocacy, for fundraising, especially the candlelight tour, in which costumed hostesses greeted the visitors. The junior board members put on a tea in one of the homes. They published a pamphlet with important historical information about the houses on the tour, about the neighborhoods. And pictured here are junior board members at Market Square, saving it from its use as a city parking lot. Many of us remember it as a parking lot. And I'm sure those who today go to attend concerts and events in Market Square are glad that it is now an open space, as it was first intended. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the spirit of preservation continued, carrying forward this legacy of preservation based on the previous successes. When Walmart was going to build on the Ferry Farm property in 1996, it was a group of concerned citizens who fought the commercial giant and made it possible for the George Washington Foundation, heir of the Kenmore Association, to acquire the property, to interpret it as a historic site, and build the replica of Washington's home. This was not a singularly women's battle, but the methodologies had been formed by women. And we all remember Ceci Howe's perseverance and determination, along with Bill Beck, who was a former historic Fredericksburg Foundation president. At that time, he was the president, and he later was the mayor of Fredericksburg. This same spirit of preservation and leadership led to the establishment of the Washington Heritage Museums in 2012, when the APVA, now Preservation Virginia, changed its focus to that of advocacy and deaccessioned properties. The Washington Heritage Museums, thank you for being members, they look after more historic museum properties in this town than anybody else. And this opportunity came about because of the change in the APVA's structure. Okay. Excuse me.
As you've seen, many of these women worked with or after their mothers in a sometimes long line of civic work. As part of their domestic duties, they encouraged their daughters and their daughters-in-law into the same civic activities in which they participated. For those of you who don't recognize these ladies, they are our ancestresses, from two of our great-grandmothers to our mother. We'd like to also recognize our sister Sally, who's here today. Sally, would you stand up? And we know that many of you also have family members who have been involved and engaged in this important work. Would you please join her?
Oh, gotta be somebody.
All right. Oh, there you go. That's right. That's right. My tech guy. Thank you for joining us. You knew that was coming. This is how we got here today.
And that was the last time that I was taller than Florence.